Hmm.
Well, good morning. Good morning. Here we are, starting off National Farm City Week on the 18th of November. And it may be kind of early in the morning to start that week, but again, it's a key date. It's a key date. And a lot of the things that we will be doing this morning also are very key in terms of the relationship between two universities. Indeed, this is a collaborative effort between Florida Gulf Coast University and the University of Florida and IFAS. We never have collaborated before, but this indeed is the beginning. My name is Stuart Van Auken. I'm the Alico Chair in Marketing. I go back to the original Alico chairs, and to give you a little bit of background, the university itself was based on a gift from the Alico Corporation. They gave us the land upon which the university was built. And so it all started from there. I came to FGCU in 2000, and I came as a result of the Alico chairs. Ben Hill Griffin III, Bernie Lester, and so on, the Alico Corporation gifted three Alico chairs to the College of Business. And so it was that basis upon which that I came here, and part of that chair was a willingness on my part and the other chairs' parts to develop a relationship with the agribusiness community. And we've been doing that ever since. And so today we continue our relationship with ag business, but also between Florida Gulf Coast University and University of Florida and IFAS. Let me set the stage as to what we will be doing this morning. Indeed, you can tell by the topic it is Florida food and COVID-19, but primarily we are concerned with assessing the impact of the COVID-19 on agriculture in the state of Florida. Our biggest concern is what is the impact of COVID-19 on Florida agriculture and the Florida supply chain. In that regard, the impacts that we have found, some will be positive, some will be neutral, and some indeed will be negative. Our concern is to indicate the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with this pandemic. We are also concerned with showing the response of various sectors in the ag business community within the state of Florida. We like to know what the responses were, and we will communicate to you what those responses, what they were, and how they are setting the future. The last thing we're going to do is really, as we go through the presentation, is focus on the outlook in the future. And indeed, what have we learned, and what kind of backfill or backstop indeed do we need to address as we look at future issues. And so, given all of that, I would like to take a moment here to introduce our two guests and to have them give us some appropriate words to start this off. We will begin with Dr. Mike Martin, but first of all, I want to tell you, though, that Dr. Martin's background, very young in his career, was at IFAS. And many of you may not have known that, but our president has a background with IFAS. Indeed, when he came, he helped to rejuvenate the relationship. We now have the Center for Agribusiness in the Lutgert College of Business, and that came from Dr. Martin. We had the water school, and so there's a lot of things going on here. So anyway, without further ado, let me turn this over to Dr. Mike Martin.
Thank you, Stuart. Very much appreciated. Make sure, okay, this technology boggles my mind, as you all know. And thank you, Stuart, and thanks for everybody participating. And thanks, Scott Angle, for participating as well. I hope an exciting new day for us working together given the challenges facing agriculture in Southwest Florida and beyond. Uh, just to reflect a bit back on what Stuart said, we lost Ben Hill Griffin, as you know, in July of this year. And I had known Ben Hill, as Stuart also suggested, from my IFAS days, met him in 1997. And we remained friends and connected up through his death. Clearly, Ben Hill was a visionary that we will appreciate every day. Not only did he see the need for and the capacity to build a university here in Southwest Florida, he and Bernie and others, but he also saw the clear need for whatever university that was to be built here to be connected to the agricultural sector in the region and to be connected to IFAS as a partner in serving the agricultural community and then in turn serving the larger region. Ben Hill and I had several conversations about this program, the Center for Agribusiness. Shortly after I got the job, he called me up and said, I want two things. I want you to start an agribusiness center and I want you to start a football team. And I said, well, Ben Hill, I think I can do one, but probably not the other. And he continued to joke, I think, about that right nearly to the end, that he wanted a football team. And we had several conversations about why it was much more important for us to get more directly involved in agriculture than probably trying to play football right now. But I do want to make a note that Ben Hill's impact on this place will last for generations. And I chatted this week, I chat regularly with his son Hill. I called to tell him that Ben Hill has been posthumously admitted to the first class or the first inaugural group of the FGCU Athletic Hall of Fame. And in the process, Hill and I had a conversation about the transition going on in their family and in their business. And we certainly want to make sure that we continue to create those connections. Just real quickly, in my conversations with Ben Hill, he was on the original advisory committee, had several objectives he wanted to see us play out in this role and in our relationship with agriculture. One is to give students from Southwest Florida who come to FGCU a sense of the opportunities career-wise in agriculture and agribusiness broadly defined. And so that if they chose to stay in the region and wanted to serve the rural community, the community as a whole, but certainly in the agribusiness sector, they would have a bit of a jump start at it. He wanted every student at FGCU, whatever their major and wherever they were from, to appreciate the significance of agriculture and agribusiness in Southwest Florida and across the state, because he thought that's something, a piece of knowledge and a piece of literacy everyone ought to have. He wanted to make sure that the citizens of Southwest Florida, who may not often travel east of I-75, understood that east of I-75 was a pretty powerful and important sector that ought to be protected and advanced. And he thought that we ought to have the capacity to work together with IFAS and others to solve real problems for the sector in any way we can that continues to make it important to this region and the state. So on the several conversations I had with Ben Hill, we talked a lot about what was percolating around the state. And in every instance, he was proud of what we've been able to do here, but he was clearly proud of what he knew would get done here. So Fritz and Alexander and Ron and all of you, those who have the Alico chairs, please know we all, everyone here at FGCU, have a responsibility to continue to build on the dreams and the vision that Ben Hill Griffin III brought us. And we had many great conversations over the years, and I joked with him on many occasions when he was here. I took him on a tour not too long before he was diagnosed with cancer, and he was very proud of the campus, but I always joked and said, I enjoyed driving up and down Ben Hill Griffin Parkway with Ben Hill Griffin, because it seemed like being in the Lincoln Memorial with Lincoln. And that was our ongoing conversation about being able to take a ride on a parkway named after the guy that created this part of the state. So in any case, thanks everybody for participating. And Scott, I'll look forward to opportunities to get together. Kelly, one day I want to drive out and chat with you a bit at Immokalee just to catch up on what's going on at the center out there and in the community. But perhaps we can get all that done as this, hopefully, as we get greater control under COVID-19. But thanks, everybody. Much appreciated.
Thank you, President Martin. We're now going to hear a few words from the new Vice President of IFAS associated with the University of Florida, Scott Engel. I know Scott is very much interested in partnerships, and we are too. The whole idea is to develop relationships and synergies, and this is the very first step in regard to that particular path. Without further ado, we're going to hear from Dr. Engel.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Fritz, am I unmuted? Can everyone hear me?
I've got you. I hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here on this campus. It's the first time I have visited. I'm sitting one floor above Dr. Aroka. I came here for two reasons. The first was to do exactly what President Martin just discussed. We are looking for greater partnership with the university at all levels. And so I'll be having conversations with the president, as well as a number of other individuals to find those touch points where we can build and even strengthen relationships that might already exist. So I'm very excited about the opportunity. And Dr. Roca, I'd like to thank you for helping to make all of this happen. I've known Fritz literally for decades, and including his family. And so he's become a great conduit between our two universities. But I'm very much looking forward to building these bridges with Gulf Coast. And I think there's a lot that we can do together. So I appreciate the opportunity. I'm also glad to help kick off this meeting today. This has been a huge issue for Florida, but nationally and internationally as well. I think we learned during the early stages of the pandemic that some things went very well. Other things went very, very poorly, and I've discussed with a lot of farmers how they suffered as a result, and how their customers suffered as a result of our inability to get the food from where it was produced to where it needs to be in a timely fashion. I think we learned that this amazing food program that we have in this country was not quite as resilient as we thought it was. COVID opened up and shined light on some of the problems that we have. We thought we were ready for this. We've had hurricanes and other disasters, and we spent a lot of time in Florida and elsewhere getting ready for these types of things. But with COVID, because it was so different, it did expose those holes. And meetings like this to document where the problems occurred, learn from them, and then make sure that if we have this or something similar in the future, we don't make the same mistakes again. So I think a lot of us know that there are changes needed. This is the very first step to begin to get to those changes. And I look forward to working with all of you as well. We are in that issue fully and are committed to it. So this is a great first step, and I want to congratulate Gulf Coast and IFAS for taking the lead on this. And in particular, President Martin, I look forward to having lunch with you later today. And we've got some, I think, really exciting things to talk about. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Engel. At this juncture, what we're going to do is sort of outline the agenda as to how we are going to proceed. And then we will turn it over to our various presenters. And before we do, though, I want to give you some additional background as to how we might proceed in that regard. But let's go to next slide. Okay, I want to go to the agenda, but that's okay, though. We have rules of engagement, though. What I want to do, though, is to let you know that we will start this off by insights into a quantitative study. In other words, we assess the extent of agricultural losses associated with the COVID-19 in Florida. That takes a lot of work and effort to do that. So we have a quantitative perspective, and then we follow that with a qualitative perspective, whereby various teams went out and interviewed. We did it by Zoom. We interviewed the major players in the state of Florida agriculture as to the impact of the COVID-19 on their operation. And what we have are the first impressions associated with that. And as we go, you will be hearing what major representatives of the ag business sector of Florida actually encountered as they went through the so-called response to COVID-19. Now, in terms of the so-called ground rules that I'm stuck with letting you know about as a moderator, one of them is that the program is being recorded. Everything has its own posterity, and this is certainly one of them. We will ask the participants to mute mics unless asking a question. And indeed, we will have some question and answer series. And we encourage the asking of questions by way of chat. As a moderator, I would more likely pick a couple of questions to be answered. But the point is, we can't answer them all. But I want you to know that since the program is being recorded, that we will come up with answers to all the questions that appear in chat, and they will appear as part of the proceedings of the recorded presentation. So keep that in mind as we go. We're trying to maintain the integrity of the program, and so with that, let's turn to Krista Court. She's going to give us insights into the so-called quantitative study, as we call it. It's like a survey and so on, responding to a number of queries. So, but she has some profiles, insights into indeed what the overall picture looks like. Let's go next slide. Oh, next slide.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm actually going to turn it over to David first, and he and I will introduce a little bit of background on the food system generally, and then Florida's food system, and then we'll get into the quantitative results.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us today. So just to kind of outline what this discussion is based around today, we want to take a look at what a food system is. And this is a very simple diagram. And food systems can exist at different contexts. You can have a local food system, regional, state, national, and international. And within all of these food systems, you have this. But as the scale increases, of course, the complexity of all of these different stages and the interactions of them increases also. So you have your input supply, your seeds, livestock, fertilizers, pesticides, machinery. You have your food production, the raw materials, feed, staple foods, the processing and packaging where you grind, fraction, recomposing and conserving. And then you have the distribution, and that's distribution of fresh as well as those that have been packaged and processed. Finally, you have the consumption. And that's where it meets the stores, where it goes to the restaurants, and where it goes into our own homes. Of course, there's an operational subsystem where you have the value chains, the actors, the institutions that kind of negotiate this. And you have these other contexts of natural resources as a subsystem, the information services subsystem. So that's the research, extension, finance, logistics, and as well as the capabilities of the system. And then you have the political subsystem, which kind of regulates and defines the parameters which the food system kind of occurs in. So that's kind of a broad outline of what a food system is. If anybody has any additional questions, please ask in the chat. But in looking at our research, that's kind of the focal point, is looking at the food system that exists within all these contexts and identifying the different facets and how they interact based on the impacts of COVID and the effects of COVID. Krista, you all ready?
Yep. We can go to the next slide. So we wanted to give a little bit of a background on Florida's food system. You know, after that great description that David just gave of the overall food system and the different contexts within which it could exist, you know, what does Florida's food system look like? We actually have growers and fishers in Florida that literally cover the A to Z of commodity production. So you can think alligators to zinnias, or avocados to zucchini. And we estimate that there's actually 200 to 300 different commodities produced within the state of Florida. So we're definitely a specialty crop state. It's not just one particular thing that we focus on. Some form of agriculture is present in every county, and I believe that every coastal county also has some form of commercial fishing landings. The food system is also an important economic contributor to the state economy. So I'm the director of the Economic Impact Analysis Program within the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida. And one of the things that we do is put out an annual report on the economic contributions of the agriculture, natural resource, and food sectors to the state's economy. So just direct contributions from these industries themselves. Production alone has $10 billion in annual sales and supports over 137,000 jobs in the state. Processing and manufacturing sector is $31 billion in sale and supports an additional 76,000 jobs. And food distribution that you see in the graphic on the left, there's really two components of this. It's food distribution for away from home consumption, and then also food distribution for at-home consumption. And those things together total $101 billion in sales in the state of Florida and support 1.2 million jobs. Next slide. So, we spoke about the fact that there's a little bit of, the good, the bad, and the ugly about COVID-19 impacting Florida's food system. So typically, food service industry demand, in 2018, the last time that this was measured, 54% of food money was spent away from home. So the effect of things like social distancing and stay-at-home orders earlier in the year really brought down the demand for food in places like theme parks, restaurants, hotels, schools, and universities. And a large portion of Florida's production actually goes into this hospitality and food service industry. So some of the numbers that we were hearing from commodities like tomatoes alone, about 80% of the production of these commodities goes into these institutional services. And so this caused a major disruption to our food system, especially back in that March to May window when things were completely shut down. Next slide. One of the things that we did, another program that we have here within the Economic Impact Analysis Program is disaster impact analysis. So after Hurricane Irma, we started to specialize in reporting the agricultural losses and damages of disasters. We didn't really expect to have to cover a pandemic within that program, but here we are, and what we ended up doing was quickly converting some of the tools that we used to assess disaster events like tropical cyclones to look at this demand event that we had with COVID-19. So we put this survey out in March when we looked at, we collected responses through mid-May. We had 729 responses collected in that particular window. 424 of them were considered full and complete response, but we also used responses from the surveys that people only answered half of the questions because we wanted to use as much of the data as possible. So you're allowed to skip a question. That's okay. We used what you were answered. And, about half of the production operations that we received responses from were small businesses. So we were getting a good sample of small and large producers. And many of the businesses were open and operating in some capacity at the time. So you'll remember that food and agriculture production was deemed an essential service or an essential industry, and 90% of the operations reported that they were open. You can see here in the graph, we were able to collect information statewide in this particular period. The seasons that we were in, there was more going on in Central and South Florida, so we received more responses from those areas. But as we move forward in time, different regions and different commodity groups would be impacted by this ongoing pandemic. Next slide, please. So if we look at just one thing very briefly, this is the changes in sales revenue by commodity group that we were able to collect. So again, we mentioned that there was some good and some bad going on, and you can see that in the range of answers that we got across these commodity groups for what happened to their sales revenue. Almost all of these categories experienced both um, positive and negative responses. But you'll see that the green bar here on the chart is showing the average response for a particular commodity group, and every one of those was negative. So again, this is that March to mid-May period. And you see that, a sector like vegetable, melons, and potatoes, some were experiencing an increase in sales revenue of upwards of 10%. Many of them reported a complete loss of negative 100%. But on an average, they were down about 24%. Next slide, please. So when we carry this forward and look at estimated losses in sales revenue across the agricultural industries within the state of Florida, again, this is only for that March to mid-May period that we were able to analyze so far. We were able to look at what the total annual sales revenues were for these industries over the last 5 years. So we don't like to take the immediate past year as the best example of what goes on, because we could have experienced something like a hurricane in that particular year, or it could have been an anomaly for any number of reasons. So we take a 5-year average and look at what are they typically producing. We then estimated the percentage of their annual revenue that would typically take place in this March to mid-May period. And we're able to look at, how much output was at risk at that time, and then use the information on percentage losses from the survey, also calculating a 90% confidence interval. So this is only for the commodity groups that we were able to collect enough data that we could say that these are statistically significant results, and then come up with the estimated losses. So you see here that across all of these commodity groups in that March to mid-May period, we estimated that Florida producers lost $894 million. Next slide.
All right, at this juncture, you've heard from Krista Court from IFAS the magnitude of the impact in a major sense there. But what we're going to do is to try to bring some additional light to the topic by going into the qualitative agricultural surveys. And again, these are the ones that are most critical, along with trying to come up with observations and conclusions. So I'm going to turn this over to David Outerbridge. He's UF IFAS, the Lee County Extension Office, and he will overview indeed what the qualitative agricultural survey will look like.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, so when we first had the inception of COVID, we were noticing we were having a lot of conversations with producers and stakeholders, and we were noticing some very interesting things happening within the food system. And these are conversations that happen fairly often with extension agents between their stakeholders. But what we identified in this situation is because of as Dr. Engel alluded to earlier, the very different type of hazard that a pandemic is, we have the ability to measure the effects on the food system because it is very impactful on the human systems. So it changed the entire food system quite quickly because of the shutdowns and because of the change in behaviors of how we distance ourselves. So what we identified was the ability to have these conversations, and the quantitative survey that Krista did is kind of like dropping a stone in the pond and measuring how high the splash is. But in having these conversations, we can really measure the ripples and identify all of the different shifts and changes within the food system as a result. So the combined use of these two techniques as a mixed methodology was a great opportunity. So we kind of had our project inputs, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side. And then we developed our project team. And this very early on, Fritz Roca and myself had conversations along with Jess Riles and many other agents, as well as researchers at FGCU, and started fleshing this out to kind of how do we identify the different facets of the food system, and how can we ask questions of those facets based on our area of expertise. And we kind of identified the different question banks: production, agriculture, input suppliers, processing and packing, transportation, logistics, wholesaling, retail distribution, school and food and nutrition services, retail distribution, community gardens, cottage food, food-related nonprofits, hugely important, restaurants, financial insurance, real estate, fisheries and aquaculture, as well as the agricultural associations. And we analyze, what we wanted to analyze in this is kind of the different facets again, but to provide research that so that durationally we could see the different steps and collect all of the stories. I mean, it's very story based, and the technology that we engaged with Zoom allowed us broader engagement. It reduced the transcription time substantially. So it was kind of a perfect confluence of all of these things happening at the same time. And what we wanted to identify was not just the impacts, not just the negative aspects, but how did different players within and agents within the food system adapt? How did they innovate? And to what degree regulation and changes in behavior enabled, enlightened different changes that need to happen? And how did COVID change the risk perception of all of these players within, were they ready for COVID? Because there was, of course, awareness that a pandemic could significantly impact our society, but were they ready for something like this? And did they understand what their role in the food chain and kind of what they did? And I think that as we go on, we'll hear a lot of information from each facet of the food system that will kind of highlight that we learned a lot. So I think that covers it. And Stuart, I think we're ready to move on.
Thank you very much, David. That's a great overview. We now have the table set. In other words, the table has been set to move into individual sectors. And I view this as like a rifle approach. Now we take a careful bead on a particular sector, and we're going to start off with Alex Magnier, associated with the Center for Agribusiness at Florida Gulf Coast University. And he's going to go into the area of input supply, which would cover areas such as fertilizers and chemicals and things of that nature, to take a look at what the impact is. What was the impact in that particular sector? Alex, it's yours.
All right. Thank you, Stuart, and good morning, everybody. So for the input sector, we interviewed a couple of companies to see how they were doing during the COVID crisis. And the two input companies that we interviewed are providing crop protection solutions to farmers and also fertilizers. And here in Southwest Florida, they were serving primarily, citrus growers and vegetable operations. So I must say that the two persons that we interviewed in these companies were actually sales representatives. So they gave us the impression of the crisis from the viewpoint of their profession, which is sales. And so these two people were dealing directly with farmers, but also somewhat with retailers and distributors. So what they said and their observations were very much consistent across the two companies. So first of all, the crisis did not affect their sales very much. And as they explained, and what we sort of already knew, is that the crisis happened at the end of the growing season for vegetables here in Florida. And regarding citrus, the sector seems to have benefited from the crisis, so sales were not really affected. What changed, however, was the way these companies interacted with their customers. So, of course, for safety reasons, they were prevented from having direct face-to-face contacts with their customers. So, all of this was pretty much new to them. And, nobody found it particularly convenient nor pleasant. But they managed to deal with it all by using Zoom or by communicating through emails, phones, and so on. So some farmers reportedly do not like much to have to sit behind a computer to communicate. And instead, they prefer to be in their fields. But in the end, it looks like everybody played the game. So regarding internal management, all the office workers were sent back home immediately at the beginning of the crisis. And from what they said, it looks like their companies were technologically ready to adapt quickly to a crisis like this one. And they actually reported that they were more efficient working from home because they didn't have to spend all this time driving to the office or going to trade conferences and so on. So it also made internal communication in these companies somewhat more efficient because people moved to Zoom or similar applications. And so it means that they now have the possibility to share computer screens and therefore show graphs and Excel spreadsheet and so on while discussing technical topics such as sales reports or sales projections. So in the long term, however, what they worried about was for their ability to maintain existing business relationships or to establish new ones and serve smaller operations if they could not have a direct face-to-face contact with their customers. And they were particularly concerned with their new sales representatives fresh on the job or with their internship program because those require interactions to train new people. So that's pretty much it. Not much of an effect on sales, but as expected, quite a bit of adaptation internally and externally.
Thank you very much, Alex. Next slide. We're now moving into the area of citrus now, and we will have Fritz Roca, the director of the Center for Agribusiness at FGCU. He'll be covering two topics. One will be citrus production. The other one will be citrus packaging and juice processing.
All right, thank you, Stuart, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for bearing with us as we get through this program. Krista earlier mentioned that in her quantitative analysis, the overall sector that involved citrus, including fruits and vegetables, had an overall negative value in terms of revenues lost. From the citrus growers we talked to in Southwest Florida, we did not find that same result. In fact, there was minimal to no effects on fruit production. COVID does not infect trees, and therefore it does not affect a grower's grove care plan. They were initially concerned, however, about the disruptions that might occur at processing plants. However, as we'll say later again, that did not happen, and citrus harvesting and daily load allocations proceeded as they had in normal years. In other words, COVID did not shut down the processing or packing houses. COVID did create some operational adjustments. These included the development of protocols following CDC guidelines, protective equipment, social distancing, testing protocols. Supervisors did have to modify the way they interacted with their team. In other words, they couldn't have face-to-face team meetings. They had to spread out, do it outside, spread out a little bit. And as we heard from Alex just recently, all direct contact with outside vendors was eliminated. Many office workers moved to remote locations, and their operations had to become more reliant on computers and computer technology. And it was interesting to note that several of our interviews suggested that those companies that invested in newer digital software and other technologies found the transition to remote working to be very smooth. And in fact, they even saw some productivity gains within their office staff. Now, while operations reported few positive tests with COVID, the specter of COVID increased stress among the office workers, field staff, and harvesters. Company supervisors had to adjust by being more flexible, mainly in terms of how they allocated work, be a little bit more flexible in their work time expectations so people can deal with children who are now at home and other issues that might be of medical concern. Everybody or every operation that we talked to paid an additional $1 per hour of hazard pay to all their workers, both office as well as field staff. Face-to-face meetings, including those with the CRDF, Department of Citrus, and even IFAS educational seminars, were stopped. That is the face-to-face part. And they were reconstituted as Zoom meetings, as we're trying to do now. The farm managers and supervisors actually reported an overall increase in their personal productivity because now they didn't have to spend the time and travel costs to go to other cases or other deals. So it's kind of an interesting counterintuitive reason. Well, maybe not so counterintuitive. Major concern though for everybody at the production level was harvest labor. 90% of our harvesters are hired through the H2A program. And there were some isolated reports that some of the H2A programs, particularly in March, when the pandemic started to ramp up, decided to leave and end their contracts early. Most, however, did fulfill their contract period, but did express a lot of concerns about their safety and the safety of their family members back in their home country. So the questions are being raised, and we'll find out very shortly as to whether H2A workers will return to Florida in sufficient numbers to carry out our 2021 season. The H2A program requires employers to provide housing and transportation to all the workers. The housing arrangements were set up prior to the pandemic when workers first arrived, and transportation usually involves passenger buses or ex-school buses that fit up to 50 people per bus to transport workers from their housing to their grove sites. During the season, the housing spaces were rearranged or additional units were acquired to help secure quarantine areas for those workers who did test positive or who were exposed to positive COVID fellow workers or other people. Going forward, lots of plans are being made to rework the housing so they can be more conforming with CDC guidelines, creating more space for the workers that are having to be housed. As the pandemic continued into April and May, transportation costs went up because now the buses that they had to run with fewer people to try to create that social distance. So in some cases, the number of drives, round trips between housing and work sites doubled because I had to cut passengers from say 40 passengers down to 20 passengers per bus. We'll go to the next slide, Stuart. Thank you. We'll talk about citrus processing now. And as was the case for the fruit production, there was little to no impact reported by those folks we talked to in the packing and processing operations. The major impact that Krista already referred to was the dramatic shift in marketing channels. The demand for citrus in the food service sector, restaurants, hotels, cruise lines, those kind of firms, pretty much went to zero. However, sales of citrus, I can't speak for other crops as well, but sales for citrus quickly pivoted to retail grocery outlets. Demand for citrus, fresh fruit, and juice increased as customers appreciated or started to appreciate the citrus for its health and wellness attributes. Retail prices for citrus went up, and furthermore, as an accentuating positive factor, since more juice was being sold in grocery stores, that meant a higher percentage of the juice, both from this season and in previous inventories, were sold as not from concentrate, which enjoys a higher profit margin than juice that was sold as frozen concentrated orange juice, which was mainly directed toward the food sector or to the food service sector. So overall, citrus had some very positive outcomes in dealing with the pandemic. As with the production side, operations and packing and processing had to deal with the internal management of their people, COVID policies to make sure that they're protected with the right kinds of protective equipment, spacing, and that sort of thing. Added costs from that equipment was important. They too paid a hazard pay of $1 per hour, and most of their office staff went remote as well, which I think you're going to hear pretty much a universal outcome of this whole pandemic. Going long term, there are three questions that sort of surfaced that kind of cross both production and processing and packing. First off, Will the number of H2A workers return in sufficient numbers to ensure a timely harvest of this coming year's crop? Second question, will the current procedures that are in place to guard against COVID infections, will they keep infections under control and avoid any possibility of having to shut down processing and packing operations for extended periods of time? Please keep in mind that these operations, packing, prep, and processing operations, are very different from the meat packing issues that we heard about in the far west. There's lots of distance that people are working in normally, and there seems to be a lot more automation involved with moving fruit through these packing and processing houses, probably with the exception of the actual fruit grading tables that require most of the people. And then finally, will prices for fresh fruit and juice, which did go up during the pandemic, will they remain at a higher level than they were at pre-pandemic levels? Higher retail prices hopefully translates to higher grower fruit prices, and the sustainability of the Florida citrus industry depends on whether those growers get the prices that they need to withstand or offset the higher costs and yield consequences associated with citrus greening. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a good day.
Hi, I'm Gene McAvoy, and I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the commercial vegetable industry in South Florida last spring, 2020. I primarily deal with large fresh vegetable operations, and that's primarily what our industry is down here. We've got about 132,000 acres on an annual basis and produce over 60 different fresh vegetable commodities. And most of that goes to supply the food service and retail grocery demand. South Florida in season supplies nearly 150 million people from Miami through Chicago, and about 70% of that goes to food service. And when I say food service, what I'm talking about are hotels, restaurants, colleges, schools, cruise ships, and it's a tremendous amount of produce. Before COVID, we were actually having an excellent season. The prices were strong. There were several reasons for that. Supplies in Mexico were down due to weather and disease issues, which created a market for South Florida growers. So we were enjoying one of the best seasons in the last 5 or 6 years in terms of prices for our commodities. But then COVID came onto the picture. We started hearing rumors of COVID, in early January. And by mid-February, the pandemic, hit the United States. And almost overnight on February 24th, the demand crashed. And that was the result of closures of hotels, restaurants, schools, and colleges around the nation. And that crash basically reduced our demand by about 70%. And growers were forced to reduce supply to match that demand. It costs money to maintain a crop. And if you don't have a market for that crop, there's no sense in throwing good money after bad money. So people were plowing up millions of pounds of product on a weekly basis. I have one grower alone that was plowing up 2 to 3 million pounds a week of green beans in the Belgrade area. Another tomato grower that plowed up over 4 million pounds of tomatoes over a 2 to 3 week period. And this is just an example of, and the same thing was going on with literally hundreds of growers in South Florida. Immokalee, where I work, typically ships 100 semi-trucks a day during season. And again, 70% of that disappeared. And if you do the math, 100 semis at 32,000 pounds per semi. So you have, 300 or, somewhere around 15 million pounds of vegetables. Market just disappeared for it. Unfortunately for us, that crash endured for about 6 weeks. And in May, we began to see a rebound. And there were several reasons for that rebound. One was that supply came back into balance with demand, and a lot of that was due to the fact that growers were forced to destroy huge amounts of produce. In May, we started to see businesses reopening to a limited basis. On our restaurants, they moved from, in-house dining to takeout. Food banks and soup kitchens picked up demand. They were assisted by money from the federal government and private donations as well. So the demand increased on that side, and supermarkets in Florida made a concerted effort to buy local and support Florida growers. So all of that came together to bring back some demand, and with the reduced amount of supply at that time, prices actually rebounded to levels above what they were before COVID came on the scene in February. In terms of our growers tend to farm in many different locations. They're geographically diversified. So it's not like, a grower in South Florida, suffered losses in South Florida, and that was the only income they had that year. Most of our growers move up and down the East Coast with the season. So many of them, or most of them, were able to rebound and cover some of those losses that they took in South Florida in other parts of the country. In terms of impact on workers, we did see some hot spots of COVID in farm worker communities. There were some H-2A workers that left early. This was not widespread, but they were concerned for their families in Mexico. So some did leave early, but again, overall, I think we had enough labor because the reduction in supply didn't need as many workers to harvest that reduced amount of produce. In terms of workers, we did have illness in the community. There were some that died. Bus drivers in particular seem to be more vulnerable, primarily because they're exposed to a lot of workers in a closed situation. If you think about it, 30 to 40 workers getting on and off the bus, walking past that driver twice a day or more, exposes him to a lot of people, or her to a lot of people. Companies have been basically very proactive in their COVID response, limiting entry to farms, enhancing sanitation procedures, insisting on mask wearing, reducing team sizing, just doing a lot of things, following CDC guidelines to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to limit their exposure and guarantee that their workforce stays intact so that they can do what needs to be done to get the crops planted and harvested on time. We did, in terms of packing and processing, we did see some shift from fresh to processing. Several growers were moving things like green beans, sweet corn, and cabbage to processors like Pig Sweet. Unfortunately, most of these are located, all of these are located out of the state of Florida. Pig Sweet, in particular, is in Western Tennessee. So while they were buying some green beans and sweet corn, it's really a break-even thing for growers. Helps them reduce their losses, but they were not making money on this. Pig Sweet paid the transport and paid them a small amount per ton for their crops, which again helped them reduce their losses. In terms of outlook, things seem to have rebounded. Right now, we're in the process of planting and starting to harvest fall vegetables, and basically seeing no change from what was planted in 2019, 2020 to this season. Growers are going at it like COVID is not there. Again, we're seeing growers, and this is a continuing trend, exploring more vertical integration. So, processing, packing, value added, like fresh cuts. Some of our medium-sized growers are exploring farm direct sales to produce boxes, if you will, direct to consumers, to see how that goes. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out this season. And again, I think it depends on how COVID plays out. If we have huge shutdowns around the country again this winter, we are seeing spikes in COVID in a number of locations and, further north where our primary markets are. As people, are forced inside and becoming more, close to each other, we're seeing spikes in COVID. So if there are massive shutdowns, it could change the game again. Hard to say what's going to happen.
Stuart,
Right. We have heard from Gene McAvoy, and we can build on his observations by moving into the area of agriculture and cattle. So the next slide would take us to Chris Privat, UF IFAS. He's with the Range Cattle and Research and Education Center with IFAS.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the beef cattle industry. I study the cow-calf, stocker, and finishing operations here in Florida. Just a little bit of an overview of some of the things we've been working on here. Whenever COVID hit, USDA asked us to do an assessment of economic damages that were caused by COVID-19 on feeder calf prices. That would help them further evaluate what CFAP payments would go to the cattle industry. A key factor whenever we think about COVID-19's impact on the beef cattle industry was that failure to move cattle through processing facilities from the March to May time period. During that time period, we got about 1.2 million head behind compared to previous years, specifically 2019. That's one of the reasons supply and demand fundamentals, they worked very well in terms of just basic economics during that time period, where you had significant reductions of supply in terms of meat proteins or beef available. And but you still had the same amount of cattle. They just weren't moving their way through facilities. So there was, that was that consumer demand for the finished product beef, not as much for the raw product there. During COVID-19, you had 125% increase in terms of beef prices at retail levels, whereas cattle prices, the producers that received the CFAP payments, they had about a 30% decline in prices if they marketed during that springtime period when they were marketing feeder cattle. Anytime we have restaurants, whether there's closures throughout the country, there's restrictions in terms of seating capacities, curfews. If there's civil unrest in downtown areas, that's not going to be bullish for us in terms of cattle and beef. We estimated that there was going to be initial damages to Florida's beef cattle industry if we marketed during the spring 2020 time period of about $242 per head. We have never fully recovered from the initial damages that were caused by COVID-19. There has been time periods where we've seen significant recovery, such as this past summer, but we've never fully recovered. We've been close to about 15% to close to normal, but still we haven't got there. We expect about 15% of the industry participants in the beef cattle industry to leave the industry over the next 10 years. Just one of the reasons is just from the additional risk and stress that's involved with marketing cattle during these high stress events. In terms of outlook, short-term outlook, you've got with COVID-19, any government mandates, I think anything's possible as we move through these winter months. Gene just hit on it. The cost to play this game has changed in terms of risk. Anytime we talk about losing potentially 30% of that revenue, during a very short time period, such as 75 days, there's a lot of risk out there. There's not many profits available to us in the beef cattle industry right now. One, due to increased animal input costs, and then where we have been in the cattle cycle whereas we're more towards the bottom of the cattle cycle right now in terms of prices. Ample supplies in terms of cattle available. It's just getting those, having that harvest and slaughter efficiency over the next 6 months is going to be really critical to get that beef available to consumers. And just in terms of long-term outlook, U.S. cattle price cycle, we're continuing to move forward. The good news is this was kind of supposed to be our bottom of the cattle market anyway. So we're going to move forward from here, hopefully get some better prices over the next decade. Supplies leveling off in 2020 and beginning to decline moving forward. With that, I will pass it back to Stuart. Thank you.
Nice job, Chris. We'll now pick up with the dairy industry. We'll hear from Colleen Larson, and she's with UF-IFAS at the Okeechobee Extension, and we have her slide here, and looking forward to hearing from her.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And just to kind of set the stage of what was going on in the dairy industry in 2020, unlike what Chris shared, the dairy industry was optimistically coming out of a really low market in 2020, looked to be, a much better year. Most producers had estimated that they had been losing money using equity and making cuts since somewhere around the end of 2014. So there was a lot of optimism going into 2020, and obviously that, quickly changed in the dairy industry. Another thing that happens kind of naturally in the spring every year is called a spring flush. And that's when cows environmentally, and because of the season of the year, just start to make more milk. So the weather is more mild, the grasses and the forages are newer, the day length is starting to get longer. And so really this was kind of the imperfect time for this to happen because of what was down the road. So the Florida dairy industry produces about 24 million gallons of milk a year, and that's about 500,000 gallons per week. And I break it down by the week because the milk that's sitting on your shelf in the grocery store is never more than a week old. So we can't turn those cows off. They're making that every week, no matter if the grocery stores are open or schools are open or not. That milk just, kind of keeps on coming. There's no off button on those. So initially in those first, the first week in March, we had about half of that production of the 500,000 gallons that just had nowhere to go. And that snowball effect just continued, to build over the next several weeks as the schools and the restaurants shut down. It's estimated that dairy usage for those avenues is somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the type of dairy product, whether it's fluid milk that we drink or sour cream and cheese, which are used more heavily in the restaurant industry. The demand in the grocery stores was growing significantly, but distribution just couldn't keep up. I included the picture in the bottom right corner because if you are the grocery shopper in your household, you probably noticed that there were some things left on the dairy shelf during this time, but the regular milk was not what was left. So people were not buying the premium and organic or the imitation products. Those products were left on the shelf, but over the years, real dairy cow's milk has lost shelf space to these imitation products. And it just really created a problem with distribution and them not being able to keep those products on the shelf when that demand increased. So the retailers put limits on the milk to try to help their consumers, and that was certainly understandable, but it just complicated the effects because the only place that the demand for milk was increasing, there were limits and they just couldn't get it on the shelf fast enough. So that's what led to the picture in the top with dairies having to dump milk. So each one of those trucks in the top holds about 7,000 gallons of milk, and there were over 200 of those dumped in the first couple weeks in Florida in the first couple weeks of the shutdown. That continued, not as widespread because some adjustments were made. Retailers that buy direct, but mostly co-ops, which is what we have in Florida, told producers that they needed to drop production somewhere between 10 and 20%. And so they did drop that production. They adjusted their feed to provide them less energy. They dried off cows early. There were a lot of methods that they used to do that. But at that time, that was in the end of the summer when things were starting to open back up. So then demand went up again. And so again, there's, no on and off switch. It was really kind of volatile for a while, trying to get that demand, that supply and demand to match in the dairy industry. The processes were not easily shifted. So there were some processors that were able to change their production into different packaging so they could be used in retail, where they may have gone into the hospitality industry, but that was a slow shift and it didn't happen overnight. There were also places that had regulatory issues. They were willing to package different types of products, but for instance, in the school system, they have to use 1% milk. And there wasn't a home for that extra cream, so they really couldn't package the 1% milk because they had that very expensive cream product that couldn't be processed. So kind of the silver lining in the dairy industry is that demand is up for all dairy products across the country. So people are returning to nutritionally superior products and animal proteins, and that's great to see. There are some other dairy producers and dairy processors that have found some other avenues for their product directly to customers and in smaller markets. And that has filled a need in some areas. It certainly doesn't fix the entire industry. When this happened, there was no quick fix for this, just like we heard from Jean with the vegetables and the milk were very similar. So there's still a lot of price volatility. The dairy price, like I said, was kind of starting to go up at the beginning of 2020. It crashed after this. It went a little bit back up in the end of summer and has now crashed again and is starting to go back up. So I'm not an economist. I know a lot of people on here are. I'd love to know what's going to happen to milk price, but I don't know that. To complicate matters further, we have a lot of volatility in the input side. So right now the commodity markets are just skyrocketing because of a lot of factors, with people speculating and buying commodities that are not direct end users. So looking forward, producers are utilizing some government protection programs and trading in the futures market at an increased rate to try to protect their margins. And then there are producers that are doing some diversification. Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of diversification that they can do. For example, one way they can diversify is breeding their dairy animals to have beef calves. And as we heard from Chris, a lot of beef producers are going out of, planning to, or they anticipate them going out of business. So that's not really an effective diversification, but it is something that's being done across the industry. So with that, I appreciate you having me here to talk about the dairy industry, and I'll pass it back to Stuart.
Colleen, thank you very much. We will now hear from Jennifer Hagan. She's with UF IFAS Extension, Lee County. Her topic will be small agriculture.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I just wanted to give a brief update on small agriculture during COVID, with the understanding that the USDA defines a small farm as one with an operating annual gross sales of $250,000. And as of the census of 2007, 93% of Florida farms fell into this category. Now, looking at some more recent census data, 2017 census data basically outlines some of the numbers for us to kind of consider pre-COVID. And that is showing that we had almost over 36,000 farms in Florida that have under 200 acres. I'm sorry, 100 acres. And then in comparison, over 45,000 of those farms have an annual revenue of under 250,000. So that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of how many small farms and small agriculture we have throughout the state of Florida. In Lee County, we have 800 plus or minus small farms, and those are 43% of our farms here. Of those 800 farms in Lee County have 9 acres or less. So you can really start to see the difference between some of the big agriculture in Southwest Florida in regards to the small agriculture. These are some of the findings that we found through our interviews. Some of the impacts of COVID-19 that we saw is that the complete shutdown of food service sector in March of 2020. And again, that's 40%, about 40% of the market shut down. And you heard Jean speaking of that. So the need for small producers to diversify from their singular markets was very important. And let me explain that a little bit. A lot of our farmers, our small farms here, produced specifically for one product. And that product may be microgreens. It could be artisan lettuce. And they produced it for a small collective of chefs for the restaurant industry. So when those restaurants closed, that demand for that product was no longer there. And so you can see how that would spiral down. And a lot of these producers who produced for those singular markets became very nervous. There was a reduction of staff for these businesses when some of these businesses were multifaceted. So producers had to look at their business plan, their operating cost, as well as their employee overhead, and potentially reduce things as needed for their operation. Farmers markets, on the other hand, were completely shut down here in Southwest Florida if those farmers markets were operating on public or park property. So again, another outlet for these producers was closed. Also, regulations were unclear here throughout Southwest Florida on what was considered an essential service. And if those food retail sectors or those producers, the vendors that would be at these farmer markets were considered essential service or not. There was confusion around those. So that was also an impact of COVID-19 on these small producers. So how did they shift? What was the pivot? What did this look like? Well, some of the findings that we found in regards to adaptations was we started to see a lot of smaller producers and local producers collaborating together. They were working together to kind of consolidate their different specific products to start creating a way to not only target new customers, but maybe put some of those products together in the form of produce boxes or community supported agriculture opportunities that they had not ventured into prior to the pandemic. Also saw a big increase on community and citizen awareness and engagement with these local producers. As the retail and big box stores shelves started to empty, people started to look closer nearby into some of these local producers' availability of products within their backyard, their community, or within the region. We also saw community-supported agriculture production start to increase, and that started to look a little differently than before. Prior to COVID, most folks would go to a farmer's market to pick up their products. Rather, in COVID, these farmers market vendors, managers, and also producers started to pivot to offer a pickup or a delivery option for their clientele when it came to their products. So while it was not face-to-face in a traditional market setting, people were now having the opportunity to pick up or have their produce delivered actually to their home. We started to see the use of outdoor agri-businesses or agritourism locations as a gathering place for the public. Since it was outside, it was available to appropriately social distance. Folks started looking for these outlets as a way to not only source their commodities, but also to reach out and connect with their neighbors and community members in a socially distancing appropriate manner. We also saw that the shift in business practices started to pivot as well. Those limitations of the COVID or the essential service regulations caused and spurred innovation. And we saw a lot of our customers, and I'm sorry, our producers innovate in ways that they had not previously. And one of the big innovations was that they started to sell on the internet. And this increased penetration of e-commerce was something that prior to the pandemic, a lot of the producers and small ag had not had a chance to actually advertise, market, and take orders online. And this became their way that they were able to connect during COVID with these customers and do direct marketing to them and offering the delivery or the potential for pickup of their commodities. And really the overview that we saw when it came to small agriculture is that these small farms and these small producers were able to adapt and innovate. And as they did, they fared quickly, or they quickly fared well. They did well. They were able to adapt, and several of them ended up having some of their best seasons ever in regards to their innovation with their business. So thank you, Stuart. I appreciate you having me. And if there's any questions in regards to small agriculture, we're happy to take them at the Q&A session.
Jennifer, thank you very much. We will now move into the area of logistics. We will have a new slide presentation coming up from Laura Barreau, who is an ALECO chair in the area of operations management, and we will hear from her associate, Elias Kirch, in the area of operation management, both at FGCU.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Stuart.
Stuart. And Jen, that was a great presentation. Thank you for that. Lee, you want to start it off?
Yes. This linking the food supply chain represents the transporting of fresh vegetables and in the production and distribution of processed food, frozen food that you find in the supermarket aisle. These companies that we interview have a major presence in Southwest area, but also part of a large network, a nationwide network, because logistics, transportation is rarely local. Source ingredients and produce comes from as far as California and Canada, including Canada. The unique story that you see there reflects the impacts observed in the survey. The uncertainty in the supply and demand sides imposed a constant reevaluation, reexamination of plant and daily operations. On the supply side, lead times have increased due to the need to comply with CDC guidelines and the uneven effect of COVID-19 on different partners on the supply chain. That means if you're producing frozen pizza, you might have the cheese, but you may not have the pepperoni. On the demand side, the focus is on the demand driven by the pandemic, leading to some postponement in the introduction of new products or food products, frozen products. We also found some changes in the dynamics of relationships imposed by social distances and the need for compliance with CDC guidelines. Less of a silo mentality within the organization, more frequent Zoom meetings, more open relationship within the functions in the organization, as opposed to a field trip from corporate officers every 3 or 4 months. We also saw closer relationship between client and supplier, a closer partnership that they're trying to solve a common problem, as we've seen before here in this presentation. It's a common problem. So just other than just providing a service for the moment, let's find a solution to the problem of production and distribution. Perhaps as no surprise, COVID-19 added to labor and capacity challenges, such as balancing personnel health and safety with the need to maintain planned schedule, for example, or scheduling a shift with the necessity of also adding sanitation procedures. You're running a tight ship now. We also had the impact of workers that might be tested positive for COVID-19. It's added to the burden of the scheduling personnel. About the future.
Lee, I just want to interject. We had, there's always, not always, but there is a driver shortage anyway. That's a major issue throughout this segment of the supply chain. And so it created an even bigger issue because there were some drivers that weren't comfortable driving and being exposed. And it was deemed an essential, part of the supply chain. Yeah. So there was no hurting in demand. Another thing that we saw, one of our participants in this research also is a grower, and they had a large outbreak of COVID, and they incurred a $250,000 cost to remediate that because of lodging and a lot of the logistics of taking care of their people. So it ranges, some of the cost structures. We had the food processor where their PPE equipment, the additional equipment, is actually being paid for by the corporate offices. So they're not actually seeing an impact of that on their bottom line as a cost. So it really depends on how it's being handled, if it's part of a larger corporation. But we saw some very unique, the other thing was the switch in consumer demand from perishable products to non-perishable. Changed the nature of the logistics movement of traffic because many people were reducing the number of times that they were going shopping, and they were stocking up and buying non-perishables instead.
Right. About the future then, it looks very favorable. An outlook is very favorable. It's a continued improvement from the earlier part of the year. But there is some caution. That's what we heard, right? Too many unknowns for long-term planning and forecasting. So transactions are really based on the spot price and short-term contract for the transportation services rather than long-term. It seems that some of the long-term contracts not being fulfilled because cannot guarantee the prices that were quoted last year, for example. So changes in the product mix, like Laura said, with focus on what is needed and what is in demand that is driven by COVID. It seems that pandemic is creating its own needs for logistics services. These fixed costs also are going to be higher for the moment, at least for the short term, and because of compliance with guidelines, but also compliance with partners in the supply chain. We are demanding a higher level of health and safety standards at the moment, and we're going to stay, and it's going to stay here for a while. Finally, some of the reorganization we saw, such as telecommuting, and the added processes to improve health and safety of the workplace are here to stay. And we heard in our surveys that some of them or most of them will be incorporating their standard operating procedure. Laura, you have any to add?
I think the segment that was hurt the most was the distributors in the logistics area because of restaurants shutting down and no cruises, et cetera. So they, as a part of the overall logistics framework, that segment had the biggest impact. The other issue was that we kept hearing over and over again was the need for flexibility, not just with the type of vehicles that they have if they're an asset-based company, but also their customers, the need to diversify their customers to diversify their risk. And Stuart, that's really all we have.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you very much, Laura and Lee. for the insights. We will continue along. We'll pick up with nonprofits and school food services. I'd like to introduce to you Catherine Campbell, UF-IFAS.
Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about food nonprofits, specifically food banks and the school food service and the impacts of COVID-19. So Feeding Florida is the food bank system here in the state of Florida, and it works in partnership with 14 affiliated food banks. Annually, they provide over 200 million pounds of food to the 2.8 million Floridians who are facing hunger. And that includes 800,000 children and 600,000 seniors. And of particular interest to this audience, Feeding Florida has a program called Farmers Feeding Florida, which partners with the agriculture industry to rescue millions of pounds of fresh produce to provide it to limited resource populations. The National School Lunch Program provides school lunches to children in both public and private schools. And here in the state of Florida, we have 2.6 million children enrolled to receive free or reduced price lunch. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. In terms of our initial findings from the interviews, there were substantial increases in need for food from food banks, with some of our respondents estimating increases of 500%. There were also increases of funding from CARES Act funding, as well as from donations from the community. And when the lockdowns were put in place, there was an increased interest in volunteering from community members. Both the school food service programs as well as food banks discuss difficulties of ensuring safety of their volunteers and participants. And for food banks, many of their volunteers are seniors, and so that puts them in a high-risk group. And so some food banks didn't want to allow those volunteers to actually come back to the food banks for their own safety. Both the school food service as well as the food banks indicated that they leverage existing and created new partnerships and processes. And one interesting thing was that some of them had developed programs back in the 2009 swine flu for curbside pickup. And they said they took those books out, dusted them off, and reworked them for the COVID-19 pandemic. Some others indicated that they use the food distribution pickup sites as a sort of one-stop shop to help support other needs of the community by doing temperature checks, wellness checks, or providing materials to the students that were doing education from home. And many of them also discussed policies serving both an enabling and an inhibiting role. So in terms of inhibiting, they mentioned the fact that the policies were overlapping. So potentially the county, state, and federal policies were overlapping and they weren't really sure which they were supposed to respond to. And then in the early months of the pandemic, those policies kept changing. But then policies also were an enabling role because the USDA federal policies allowed for waivers in terms of the types of operations that school food service could implement. And I will turn to that on my next slide. So a success story from this is from the Alachua County Public School Farm to School program. The Alachua County Public School District serves 29,000 students in Central Florida. And Kelly Brew, the Farm to School coordinator, was able to purchase 14 products, including kale, sweet potatoes, and blueberries from local farms. And she created bags that resembled high quality CSA boxes that could be sent home with students. And historically, that wouldn't have been allowed in the National School Lunch Program, but she submitted for a waiver to be able to do this. And she worked with the UF-IFAS Family Nutrition Program to create recipes in both English and Spanish that were put in the food bags to help the people who receive them know how to cook healthy recipes from the food they received. And from this effort, they were able to purchase more produce in April, May, and June of 2020 than they did in the entire previous year. In terms of future outlook, they're seeking to build on these successes from these new partnerships and processes. For example, the waiver that I just mentioned with the Alachua County Public Schools, They just received word that they're going to be allowed to extend that through the end of this school year. And both food banks and the school lunch program respondents indicated that they were feeling positive about the increased awareness in sort of the public eye of food banks and the National School Lunch Program. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Nice presentation. We'll now pick up with our next presenter. That is Tim Allen. He is an Alico chair in the College of Business. He'll give us insights into the area of finance, land appraisal, and insurance.
Thank you, Stuart. Hello, everyone. There's an old saying in real estate that under all is the land, and certainly under agriculture is the land. There may be water between the product and the dirt, but it's still there. So in this section of the study, we talked with a real estate market observer who happens to be an agricultural land appraiser familiar with the agricultural land market statewide. He reported, or that representative from that firm reported that deal volume that had already been initiated before the lockdown occurred took about 2 months to clear through the market. But little new business was generated during the first 2 months or so of the pandemic. But that market benefited from increased interest from institutional investors who saw land as a safe haven investment, a place to park some money for the long term with lower risk and, of course, lower returns. But from the market's perspective, that increased demand from institutional investors resulted in value increases that we're still seeing even now into the fall of 2020. So the impact on ag land values of the pandemic, we can't say it is values are increasing more than they would have been, but at least we're seeing increased deal volume and increased values during the pandemic. As far as retail banking and agricultural banking goes, in the early months of the pandemic, of course, with the reduced mobility of people, there was an immediate effect. Lenders responded by changing their business practices, including equipping their employees for working from home. So there was some spending on additional training that the HR departments had not anticipated, as well as some new computer technology to allow the business to go on as normal. And that took a few weeks in most cases, it seems, to get everybody up to speed and get operations working. But the lending industry found itself in competition with federal government programs for capital. So there was no, in fact, they said, we actually lost some business, not because people didn't want to borrow money or wanted to borrow any more money. It's just that there were other alternative sources that were usually not part of our market. The benefits of the pandemic to the agricultural lending industry will be, we think, some long-term efficiency gains. I think some of the lenders realize that they can operate more efficiently with some people not working in an office space provided by the company, and so working from home for certain back office operations is going to be more accepted and more typical as time goes forward. So there could be some gains that we didn't anticipate there. And also in terms of retail offices for walk-in customers, I think there's been a change in the way that a lot of customers do their banking and will become more comfortable with distance banking or online remote banking, even for ag lending as time goes forward. In terms of crop insurance, we found basically no impact. The nature of that business is seasonal, of course, but it's usually based on longstanding relationships between lenders and insurers and insureds, and so we saw no real impact other than the normal physical distancing requirements and masks in some meetings as that business continued. So overall, some good things and some bad things came out of the pandemic so far for financial services and real estate markets and crop insurance. But we have some resiliency on that side of the ag industry, I think.
Sebastian Galindo with UF IFAS. And he will be giving us his perspective on data analysis.
Okay. Good morning. As David mentioned earlier, this is a mixed method study that began with a quantitative survey. And the survey was followed by qualitative interviews that were conducted remotely via Zoom. And the main purpose of the interviews is to further expand and explain some of the survey findings. However, they will also be invaluable to identify new and sometimes unexpected impacts, changes, and responses associated to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the previous presenters have already shared their initial insights from this activity. Our goal is to conduct up to 225 interviews across the state with key stakeholders representing the different agricultural sectors that have been introduced in today's presentation. And as you can imagine, this represents a huge effort, not only in terms of collecting the data, that is by itself a big task, but the main effort is going to be on the analysis of those data. This analysis is going to be done using a specialized qualitative data analysis software. And I am not going to bore you with the details of the analysis or the software, but I must say that the process will be very complex and labor intensive. We are really talking about analyzing thousands of pages of data. Going through all this effort is very important and necessary, particularly when we consider everything that we can achieve from this study. We want to better understand the different impacts of COVID-19 on Florida's food system or systems. This will allow us to identify and prioritize the needs and opportunities that are present for the different stakeholder groups. And with this information, we can definitely increase the quality of our research and extension efforts, and also design short, mid, and long-term strategies to enhance resilience across the system. One thing that I want to say is that I cannot overemphasize how happy and proud I am of being part of this truly multidisciplinary collaborative team that combines the expertise from Florida Gulf Coast University and the University of Florida IFAS. The whole process has been a learning experience in itself, and this effort will help us identify the risks and vulnerabilities of our food system, pinpoint the strategies that worked, where these strategies worked, when and for whom, for which stakeholders. And finally, we will have opportunities to reflect on what we all, everybody that has been part of this, that is part of the food system, that we contribute to the food system at different levels, what we have learned from this public health emergency, and also what needs to change if we want to be better prepared for the future. And thank you, and I will pass this back to you, Stuart.
Nice job, Sebastian. I'm going to go ahead with Krista Court. Again, you know, she's from UF IFAS. She actually picks up real well on what Sebastian was talking about. We're looking at continuing surveys and interviews to assess lasting impacts. In other words, you have a lot of first impressions. So, Krista, it's yours.
Anyway, sorry, we've heard a lot today about all of the efforts that we've gone through so far and first impressions on what we've learned from both the quantitative survey effort that our program put together, as well as the interviews that we've done as an entire team. But it doesn't stop there. So I want to emphasize that all of these efforts are continuing. We continue to collect information via survey for the quantitative effects of COVID-19. The results I presented earlier were from the March to mid-May period, but we know that things are changing over time. So we have a survey open for agricultural producers now that asks about both Q1 and Q2 and how those impacts were different. That will close around the time of Thanksgiving, and then we won't come back again to analyze Q3 and Q4 until sometime in January. That survey tool will open. The reason for that is that we found a lot lower response rate the second time around, and everybody, it's completely understandable. Everybody's getting a little bit of survey fatigue and pandemic fatigue, so we want to give folks a break, but then come back and see how things changed for that second half of the year. The interviews are continuing as well. So if you are on the line and are a producer or a part of any kind of stakeholder in the food system and are interested in being interviewed and sharing your stories, we would love to hear those. Again, these interviews will continue to collect information on how impacts are changing over time. And, as Sebastian suggested, we're hoping to get up to 225 interviews, and I would say that we're about halfway there. So if you are a producer, know a producer, or know anyone in any of these other industries along the entire food system chain that we've spoken about, we would love to hear from them. All of this gives us several data sets actually for several areas of research. So we can continue to use this information to look at things like hazard risk perception, mitigation, and planning for the future, improve localized food systems, food chain adaptation. It can provide a basis for many different specific areas of focus, and we will obviously continue to do that as well. And, I'll emphasize that we can't do this without those responses. A lot of this information at the detailed level in terms of a specific commodity or a specific region is not available publicly. And even if we were to wait for public data sources to come out a year, 2 years from now, it's not available at that fine scale detail. So we really can't do this without the people that are willing to share that information with us. And really just looking at developing tools and practices for a future response. So we have some new external funding coming in. We have a multi-institutional effort with partners at the University of Florida, University of California, Irvine, University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, and Kansas State University, where we're starting to look at how impacts were different in different states for some of these commodity groups. So all of this is really about collecting data and learning lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic so that we can make the food system more resilient.
Thank you very much, Krista. As you've heard, this is not an ad hoc type of research enterprise. It's a longitudinal study, and we're just beginning. The idea is to produce coordinates over time so we can certainly plot the trend line. Fritz and Dave,
Sure.
Thank you very much. We've now really come to the end of the conference. And in my role as moderator, I would like to thank all of the participants, all the individuals that worked for UF and IFAS, and my colleagues at FGCU that have helped to produce the insights that we now have achieved. The partnership, indeed, I envision as being something at the very beginning. But last but not least, I would like to thank all of the individuals that filled out the questionnaires and so graciously gave up their time for us to interview them by Zoom to achieve the qualitative insights that help make this presentation indeed what it is. And so given that, I will reaffirm again that this has all been recorded and that the recordings will be made available at FGCU and also UF IFAS. There'll be some splicing in that regard though, but with all of that, I wish you my best and I bid you adieu.
Okay, I guess as we sign off.